Hi, I'm your host, Jürgen Strauss from InnovaBuzz, and I'm really excited today to welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, all the way from Chicago in the USA, Michele Wucker, who's a strategist and best-selling author and founder of Gray Rhino Company. Welcome to the InnovaBuzz podcast, Michele. It's a great privilege to have you as my guest.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here.
Salema Gurani, who was our guest on episode 517 of the InnovaBuzz podcast, she introduced us and suggested that we have a conversation. So big shout out to Salema.
Yes, I'm a huge fan of Salema and Happio, her new startup.
That's right. Yeah. And we had a fascinating chat about that, and I'm still watching carefully as to where that's headed. Now, you've authored two books that I know of. There might be more, but these are the ones that get a lot of attention, I guess, on the internet. Books called The Gray Rhino and You Are What You Risk. And of course, the Gray Rhino is kind of a metaphor, right? So I'll let you explain that in a moment. But before we do that, what's the impact you're making in the world, Michele?
Oh, wow. A lot of people are thinking and doing things differently. From day-to-day things like my friend who hadn't done his taxes and started to get the back taxes done. Didn't get all the way there, but started, to companies changing their strategies, to central banks and governments changing their financial risk policies, particularly across China. And maybe the coolest thing is that the band BTS from Korea, you may have heard of them, pretty much the most popular band in the world right now, actually used the Gray Rhino metaphor in one of their songs about depression and anxiety and the need to deal with it.
Fascinating. Well, that's pretty wide-ranging impact there. And so let's go back to that metaphor. So explain the metaphor and how you came to that idea of the Gray Rhino.
Sure. Well, picture there's a big rhino standing in front of you. His horn is pointing at you, and he's stomping the ground and snorting a little bit, and he's getting ready to charge at you. And you've got a choice of what you're going to do. And that's really what the Gray Rhino is all about. It's about taking a fresh look at the big, obvious, hard to miss thing in front of you and doing a better job at responding. And it's rhino because obviously big and scary with a horn. That part is easy, 2 tons. And it's gray because if you go to the zoo when you're 5 years old and you look at a big rhino at the zoo and someone asks you what color it is, you'll say gray. But if you're a grown up and someone has told you that there's a species called the black rhino or the white rhino, then you might call it black or white, even though it's gray, which is a metaphor for really missing the obvious thing unless you're paying attention. And it's related to 2 other animals, the elephant in the room, which by definition, nobody does or says anything about. And the gray rhino is the thing that people are talking about, and some people are doing something about, and you really want to be one of the people who's doing something about it. And the other one is the black swan, which gets a lot of attention in financial markets, but it's so unforeseeable and improbable that it's really hard to do much about it ahead of time. And a lot of policymakers and portfolio managers who lost their clients' money will look at something bad that's happened, like a big market crash, and they'll say, "Oh, black swan, nobody could have seen it coming," and it wasn't intended that way by the author. The author really meant it as a way of making us think about what an uncertain world we live in. But they used it as a cop-out, as an excuse for something that a lot of people did see coming, and they ignored, and they're trying to convince their clients that it was okay. So the Gray Rhino is really a challenge, the metaphor for the big scary thing coming at you, and a challenge to be one of the people who does respond or not. And it came out of my experience writing about geeky sovereign debt crisis things between Argentina and Greece. But the question is just so much bigger than that. It applies to everything from daily life to the biggest 30,000 foot policy questions to CEOs and business and boards.
Yeah, it's a fascinating metaphor. And I mean, the whole idea of this, that we kind of ignore risk, and the other animal I thought of was the ostrich that buries its head in the sand, so it doesn't see.
Yes,
If I
that's
can't
definitely,
see it,
and the see no evil, hear no evil, see no evil monkeys too.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. If I can't see it, it can't be bad. Um, the the idea that we miss so much of the obvious, it seems counterintuitive, because we're almost programmed to fear everything, and which has served us really well as a species, because we wouldn't be here if we didn't have that fight or flight mechanism built into our brains. But it gets in the way so much, doesn't it? We kind of avoid taking risks, taking calculated risks, and hence capturing opportunities because of that fear. And yet on the other side of that equation, there's this, we tend to overlook these obvious big risks that are staring us in the face, and the horns pointing right at us, and the I don't know what they do when they're scratching their hooves.
They snort and they kind of shake their heads back and forth. I've seen a lot of rhino videos. I actually went on safari, but we didn't have any kind of a confrontation like that. We found a bunch of sleeping ones, and the other ones were far away, hiding behind the grass. So I didn't have that, great moment that I wrote about in the book, but used my imagination, just like I hope readers do.
All right. Well, why do you think some people actually recognize those big risks in advance, and others either don't recognize them or kind of shut them out?
Yeah, well, it starts with self-awareness, and it's been very interesting to see how people have responded to the concept culturally. I mean, you mentioned that it's sort of counterintuitive that we ignore the obvious things. Well, what was interesting is when I first was shopping the book around to publishers in the U.S., all of these editors came back and said, "Well, of course we need to deal with obvious things, but they're obvious and we're dealing with them. So, why do we need a book about it? It's not counterintuitive." And I went, "Oh man, this is so counterintuitive. They don't even know it's counterintuitive." Yeah. And it's this, this sort of, particularly American, but I think some other Western cultures have the same attitude. It's that well, we're on top of things. We know what we're doing. And, increasingly we're seeing that people don't feel that way. And then the book came out in Asia, particularly in China, and they immediately got what I was talking about. They said there are these big things that, they're often the kind of wicked problems that are hard to resolve. And partly because, people don't like to make the hard decisions. And one of the reasons that people often don't pay attention to gray rhinos is that there's something called solution aversion. Climate change is a very common example, but, budgeting or not eating that cheeseburger because you need to go on a diet because your doctor says so. Yeah. Those sort of things. If you don't like the solution, it's called a solution aversion, then you're more likely to pretend that the problem is not a problem. Or in business or policy contexts, if you are benefiting from the status quo and other people are paying the cost, well, then you don't want anybody to recognize the problem. It's like tobacco or, climate change, fossil fuels, that sort of thing. So there's something called manufactured denial, where people who don't want to change things really rely on that human defense mechanism of ignoring what you don't feel you have the power to do anything about. And they really prey on that natural denial. And on the other side, denial, we have denial in our brains as one of our defense mechanisms, because sometimes if something feels too big, we can just collapse. It's like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross writes about in the 5 stages of grief, with denial being the first one, is that denial is the defense mechanism, so that you kind of let the problem in gradually so that you don't have a nervous breakdown. Yeah. And that's fine, but if you continue to deny past the point where it's useful and to the point where it lets a problem turn into a bigger problem and then to a crisis and a catastrophe, then that's the problem. So being aware of the fact that you are likely to look away from the obvious thing. And that it's not your fault. I mean, it's these little gremlins running around in your brain. But when you're aware of that, you can kind of, whip these gremlins into shape. And in a business or innovation context, if you're the person who comes up with a solution to the problem, or even if you're the person who stands up and says the problem's there, you're way ahead of everyone else. And, when you talk about risk taking, there are, as you say, calculated risks, kind of positive risks, investing in education, investing in a startup, buying, riskier stocks as opposed to the super safe ones, where you calculate that and you see that the likelihood and the size of the gain is bigger than the likelihood and size of the loss. That's sort of a positive risk taking. And too many people focus way too much on the negative so that they don't take the good risks. But there are also people who focus so much on the potential gain that, that stock that your cousin's mechanic told them about, that they forget about the downside of it. And so they don't really estimate the size of things or the probability of things as likely it is. And we've certainly been seeing that with a lot of the day traders who've lost a lot of money in the markets getting really, really bouncy over the last few months.
Yeah. And of course, that stock trading is a great example because there's this herd mentality that comes into play there as well. With we're seeing that really play out with these meme stocks, right?
It's true. And actually that herd mentality is an example of another one of these little gremlins, the groupthink gremlin. And it's that when you have a bunch of people sitting around the table, then it becomes much harder for any one alternative point of view to be heard amongst all the other ones. And that's even worse if everybody comes from the same profession, the same background, the same generation, the same demographic. And so it's why having a diverse group of people around the table helps you to identify potential red flags, and it helps you to have a good structured debate and consider in a much more thoughtful and reasoned way the potential for gain, the potential for loss, the likelihood of gain, the likelihood of loss, and the kinds of things that you can do to make it more likely that you gain more and lose less, and that you have some plans to pivot if something doesn't quite go the way you want it to.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The idea of risk being kind of the other side of that coin of opportunity being the other side of the coin of the risk, and then how to balance that is a really fascinating way to look at this. How do you see organizations bringing both that risk awareness of the Gray Rhino kind of effect, and then capturing opportunities at the same time, bringing that into their organization? You talked about diversity, their diversity of backgrounds and everything else, and there's lots of talk about diversity these days, coming from, I think, the idea that there have been groups that have been underrepresented. So we talk about race diversity, gender diversity, ethnicity diversity, lots of conversation now around bringing more people with so-called handicaps or so-called disabilities.
Neurodiversity, they like to call it.
Yeah, so all of those things obviously contribute to different thoughts and people seeing different things or bringing different perspectives to play. How do you see balancing that risk and opportunity equation, and what can organizations do to kind of find a really good middle ground there?
Well, like Gray Rhino theory, it starts with self-awareness, and there's a huge range of risk cultures at organizations, and I actually use the term risk fingerprint just as I do for individuals, which is a combination of Sort of for individuals, it's your innate personality. For a company, it would be your corporate culture and the experiences that you've had. I mean, a company that has gone through a near bankruptcy is going to have a very, very different attitude towards risk as a startup during a boom that has tons of venture capital money to throw around and, wants to move fast and break things. And the third part is the most important one because it's what you have the most control of. And that's the people you surround yourself with, the sort of habits that you have, the self-awareness, the decision-making processes. And you need to look at all three of those together when you're looking at a company and see if that risk fingerprint matches the way it sees itself. I mean, is it a company that sees itself as being innovative? Then if that's the case, who are the kind of people who are working there? Or if it's a company that's, I call them legacy companies, the big traditional company that people mean when they say working for the man, quote unquote, where in a lot of cases, the biggest risk is doing things that are different from the way we've always done things. And so, everybody's going to perceive risks very, very differently. And I think the companies that are most likely to be innovative and fast growing are the ones that do have different perspectives, both to identify opportunities and to identify risks. And you've probably heard a lot about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. The shareholder idea is that all you care about is, the money that goes to the shareholders, and stakeholder capitalism being much broader. But a lot of people miss that stakeholder capitalism can actually be very beneficial to shareholders. Because it can help to protect you from reputational risks. It can reduce employee turnover. It can help you to identify different areas of opportunity. It can smooth your relationship with regulators and policymakers. So I think it's important too that your company, in addition to having a diverse group of people, make sure that it's got ways to listen to the voices of those different stakeholders, your suppliers, the community officials, the employees, the customers, the investors, making sure you're getting all those points of view in. And of course, that makes things messier in a certain way. It makes it harder to come to decisions. You need a little bit more time, but ultimately the result is likely to be much better. And one part of diversity that really doesn't get enough attention is risk diversity. Everybody's got a different risk fingerprint, which includes their personality. There's a great outfit out of the UK called Psychological Consultancy. It has a tool called the Risk Type Compass that has 8 personality types based on how anxious or calm you are and how methodical or impulsive you are. And so you have that innate personality, the experiences of the people who are on a team, on the board and management. And then you have the processes, the deliberate things that they do to pay attention to things and their self-awareness. And so if you look around a room, say a boardroom, or, look around the top management meeting, look and see if people have how different their risk fingerprints are from their personalities and other things, because something that one person sees as the big scary danger is something that someone else is going to say, hey, nobody else is solving this problem. And, what's the first question the venture capitalists ask? What's the problem you're solving for? Yeah. And so that difference of personalities and experiences can actually help you to identify opportunities where other people might not, as well as identify some of the gray rhinos, the red flags ahead of time, so that you've got a good way to respond to them and not get trampled.
And also, in taking some calculated risks in pursuing an opportunity, there's always going to be some risks there that need to be contingencies in place for that, right? So it's not just, okay, I see this as an opportunity. You might see it as a risk. It's like, if it's an opportunity, then there's risks in going down a certain path to pursue that opportunity. And we need to be aware of those. Opportunity
costs, like, hey, this opportunity looks really interesting, but what are we giving up for that? And another very important part of it is risk perception. some people might see something as very risky and someone else, doesn't bother them at all. It's like, if you cut your finger with a knife, one person, says, I only want sporks from now on. No more knives. And the other person says, oh, I'm going to go be a sushi chef. I cut myself and it was no big deal. It's fine. And so people react very, very differently. In the future, the one person sees the knife as a bigger risk. The other one sees it as a smaller risk. And that risk perception is something that's so much more slippery than most people think about. And it's not always voluntary. It comes from this psychology. It comes from the people around you. There's something called risky shift, which is that the decisions of a group are likely to be either much more risk seeking or risk avoidant than, the sum of the people in the room. That groups really sway everybody's risk perceptions, and other things like the temperature in the room. If it's really cold, then you're going to be more comfortable taking risks. There's just scientific studies that show this. If you have spicy food for lunch, whether you love spicy food or not, it's actually going to make you likely to take more risks. The color in the room, the beat of the music. If you want something that's really fast tempo, then that's going to help you get your courage up, or to take your inhibitions down. And so being aware that so many of us are taking risks, are making choices, and we're not even aware of all these subconscious influences that go into that. Well, it's actually kind of scary when you think about it. And, and interestingly, knowledge and control are two things that make you feel more comfortable with uncertainty and also with smart risk taking. And that's partly because the more you know about a situation, the more likely you are to be able to make the right decisions if things start going the wrong direction.
Yeah. And be nimble or agile enough to react quickly to keep things on track for the desired outcome. Absolutely.
And this, knowledge is also a big part of risk perception. In You Are What You Risk, I talk a lot about the work of Paul Slovich, who's, the risk perceptions guy. And he talks about all sorts of characteristics of both of the risks itself and your relationship with it as affecting how much you're willing to tolerate. And that's, if you have more information, if you feel like you have more control, if you have a choice of taking this risk or not, then you're more likely to be more comfortable with it than if it's something that's just, imposed on you, or something that you don't know much about, that you don't trust the experts about, that the experts don't agree about. So this role of knowledge and control in risk taking is hugely important.
It occurs to me in this conversation that this is the idea of the Gray Rhino and our risk profile individually and as a group, particularly in the corporate world, is so important in innovation. And having lived through kind of the transformation of the photographic industry from film to digital from the inside, I see that as one really example of, there was the Gray Rhino. I was one of the few people that said, hey, there's a Gray Rhino. And I was just a young man at the time. I didn't have enough clout and people didn't listen. I use the term there that they behaved like an ostrich in that sense. And of course, there's lots of other examples of that. There's the other one that's talked about quite a lot is the DVD rental industry. I can't even remember the name of the company now that disappeared. And Netflix transformed.
Before that,
Blockbuster. That's it. Blockbuster.
Netflix has actually been quite successful in dealing with gray rhinos of its own. I remember when streaming was just starting, they did a lot of thinking. Were very proactive about that because people were not going to want the DVDs anymore, and so they developed algorithms to help to recommend what you might want. They did a lot of thinking about pricing, and it didn't go smoothly. There were some bumps along the way. And then, of course, their Gray Rhino now is that everybody and their cousin is doing streaming content. And so that's a whole other Gray Rhino that they're still going through.
That's right. That's now people like Amazon and Disney and others that have this established business to build off the back of, and probably have deeper pockets than Netflix might have because they're just focused on that one particular service.
And to be honest, it's not great for consumers. I mean, on one hand, you can get smaller bundles of things, but who wants to have to sign up for 7 different services? Yeah. And I mean, it's impossible to keep straight. So I think they're all going to have to deal with that at one point. Hulu started out as a partnership among all the networks, and now they're all going and spinning off their own things as well. And, that's, as somebody who has watched more TV in the last 2 years than I did in my entire life, I've been super happy at the quality of some of these series and from around the world, things that you wouldn't have had access to. But when you have to sign up for yet another service to get the ones that you want, you just want to throw your hands up and say, all right, already.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Is that a Gray Rhino that presents an opportunity? Because obviously there's a problem there. There's if somebody were to come up with a way, okay, here's a service, you subscribe to this one service, you get access to all these different things. That certainly might be a huge opportunity, right? And a Gray Rhino for each of those industries.
Yeah, and I think it's, it goes to this this question of competition and consolidation. I mean, when they get together and offer you a bunch of things, then you don't have to sign into all the different options. But at the same time, as competition shrinks, that's not so great for the customers either. And the worst case scenario is that consumers just say, "All right, I'm gonna do something entirely different." So it's hard, it's challenging. The answer is not always easy, and I think the hardest type of Gray Rhino to deal with is the one where the answer is you need to let something get trampled. I mean, it's, like say Kodak with their, the old film cameras. They were the ones who, started the digital photography, and they didn't want to develop it because they were so afraid of cannibalizing their existing revenue. And so they lost the existing revenue and they lost the chance to follow the new one. And, in that case, the right decision was let the Gray Rhino trample the old film. And that's the case for a lot of companies. I think we're seeing it right now with, with energy. And there's a lot of resistance to some of these new technologies that, that are cheaper. And we're seeing that play out with the energy security crisis.
Yeah. It's interesting. The conversation around how do you match that taking part in the disruptive technology that clearly has some benefits and has the potential to take over from the core business. How do you match that with protecting your core business until the point where you can switch over? So in essence, it's like managing that total portfolio of your income, right?
Yeah, it's very hard. And even, for any kind of company, a company that's reached maturity and has grown as much as it's going to grow, it becomes a lot harder to create more value going forward. And I think that's why we see so much M&A, even though the numbers show that mergers and acquisitions are not as likely as people would like to end well. You see a lot of them failing, and there's this, there's just a lot of mess. And I think there's some times where you just have to say this is as big as we're going to go, and as if we want to grow quickly, we're going to have to invest in something else. And we'll keep this particular service going. And I think it might go, pricing is one way. If the quantity of the old business that you sold is falling, when the price will go up. And, I think that's where we're going to end up going with fossil fuels. It's going to be bumpy getting there, but I think it's, I think that's the only way to get there.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, it's interesting with that example of the fossil fuels and the fossil fuel companies, how some are clearly putting things in place to make that transition over time, and others are just hanging on for dear life to the old model.
It's hard, and and I think it's not just the particular company, but you look at the what I call a risk ecosystem, which is all the outside factors that affect things, and so that includes the kind of government safety nets, what gets subsidized. If you look at the tax system, if you're still, taxing things that you want to see more of, well, that doesn't make sense. And if you're subsidizing things that you want less of, then that doesn't make sense at all. What's the education system? What's the risk communications system? How do you make sure that people can invest in things and have a reasonable chance of getting their money out, but that also there's a certain system that will tolerate failure, because who is it that says if you're not failing, sometimes you're not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
And you hear about so many entrepreneurs where investors will take another chance on somebody who's failed in an earlier venture because they know that person has learned some lessons, but it's very different in different cultures around the world. So if you're evaluating a company, you need to look at all of those factors around it. And if you're doing a merger or acquisition, saying, innovative companies often get bought by a much bigger company. And then there's the question of how do you make sure that there are enough ties between the new and the old, but that you don't destroy the innovative culture. And it's very hard because those kind of companies attract very, very different employees.
That's right. And usually it's the bigger company that's the traditional one takes over a little innovative company, and they often just get lost in the day-to-day grind, right?
Which is sad.
All right. So how do companies then approach this idea of building a risk culture that matches their risk fingerprint, to use your term, and at the same time supports innovation?
Well, I think the first is to have a very open conversation about risk to get a sense of how comfortable your employees are with risk. And that starts with the recruiting process. I often encourage people to ask the question, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? Because that tells the world so much about you, about what's important to you, what you're hoping to gain, what you're afraid of losing. And
love the question.
Also the question is, what's the biggest risk you've ever passed up on? And that's very, very important. I think it's also important to go past stereotypes. There are a lot of risk stereotypes about women who may not get promoted because they're not seen as willing to take enough risks, when actually the research shows that there's a 95% overlap between men and women in their risk preferences. And the place where there's the biggest disconnect is the less experienced people. That less experienced men are likely to take more risks, and less experienced women are going to want to do the homework first. But if you get people at the same level of experience and education, they're very similar risk preferences, although there's also research that shows that women tend to do better managing through a crisis. And they're also better at looking back in hindsight and evaluating which decisions were good and which ones not so much, and that they can learn from. And that also goes to startups. A lot of women founders talk about how they have to bring a male employee into the room with them when they're raising funds, because otherwise the investors will think that they're not willing to take enough good risks. So being aware of the stereotypes, understanding someone's risk personality and where that puts them. There's a great story that Jeff Trickey told me, the founder of the creator of the risk type compass. He said that there was a company he went to, and this was when the Europe's data protection, the GDPR law was just being implemented, and they did personality, the risk type test of the whole team, and most of the people were more carefree and more risk seeking. And she came across as something that was considerably more boring. And she was really disappointed. She didn't want to be, I forget if it was prudent or whatever, but she was really sad. But then she realized that she was the only one who was going to pay enough attention to make sure that the company was in compliance with GDPR. And then she felt better about herself. But a lot of careers have clusters of risk types. Air traffic controllers, for example, or lawyers, except that the litigators and the contract lawyers have different types. And so understanding if you've got the right sets of people, if you've got a diverse set of risk types, and also you look at the culture. What does the company reward and what does it punish? Does the company take feedback in a good way? Are people aware that if they raise a risk, it's going to get up into the ears and the heads of the people with the power to do something about it? Do you have a good risk decision-making process with all the inputs that you need? And what kind of preparations have you made for those days when maybe things don't work out the way that you want? Do you have an emergency plan, a business continuity plan? We saw that during the pandemic that a lot of companies had to rework their supply chains, and this sort of just in time is now becoming just in case, and maybe a little bit too much. We're hearing a lot in the States. I don't know if you're hearing it there too, but about some companies actually have too much inventory now. So it's really hard to get it right. But to have a dynamic approach to risk with Gray Rhinos in the final stage action, I always remind people that just doing the action isn't enough. You have to track whether it's working out the way you wanted it to or not, and then go back and continue to make adjustments and go back and just touch base, say once a quarter or whatever the appropriate period is, just to make sure that things are still going the way you want, to see if there are other Gray Rhinos that you are putting your blinders on too. So it's self-awareness, it's processes, it's empathy for the employees, and understanding team dynamics as well.
Yeah, lots of interesting insights there, and just you mentioned empathy at the end there, and I think it's important that listening to those various inputs and then building that culture of actually rewarding people if they bring up those risks, and listening, and then having conversations around, well, is there something we need to take action on, or is this something that is less important than this other big grey rhino that's coming from the left, who's actually the father of this little baby one.
Yeah, so, and empathy it's getting so much, the whole concept's getting so much attention in business these days. And one of my favorite examples for thinking about it is that you and your coworker have to share a taxi to the airport for a business trip. And one of you is the person who likes to get there way too early and have a couple drinks before you get on the plane. And the other one likes to wait until the last minute.
Yeah.
And so at workshops, I always ask people, I get a lot of laughs. How much time do you leave to get to the airport? I did one, it was with cities across the United States, many of which, like Chicago or Houston, have challenging airport commutes, to put it politely. And people just laughed so hard. But I said, okay, how do you and your coworker resolve this? And just, sometimes people will say, oh, my coworker, he's such a jerk. He wants to do it this way. And when you realize that you've got different reasons for that, I'll leave less time because I have a, global entry TSA pre-card that lets me go through the fast lane. Or, there was a time when I came so close to missing a plane. Luckily, there was a small mechanical issue and they delayed departure by 15 minutes. So I got on it. But after that experience, I was leaving a lot more time. So, your recent experiences with bad traffic, but realizing it's not that someone is just being, a jerk. It's that there are reasons that they are approaching things that way. And when you find that empathy as to why each of you is approaching something differently, it's much easier to find a middle ground. And that also extends to a very particular kind of employee who I think is so important to anyone who's concerned with innovation and creativity. And that's the squeaky wheel kind of employee, the one who takes a social risk of speaking up and saying, hey, are we missing this? Hey, what about that? Or, the person who goes against gender stereotypes, the guy who doesn't barrel ahead with risk and says, hey, have we consulted the experts on this? Those people who are willing to stick their neck out are also more likely to be creative and innovative. And the very interesting part about this is, intuitively, it seems very clear that there's a link between risk taking and innovation and creativity. But the academics have had a very hard time actually proving that. And the area where some of the strongest evidence exists is actually this correlation between the social risk, the saying the thing that nobody else wants to say, and the innovation and creativity. So instead of saying, oh, that person who's, always raising these points that nobody wants to hear, that person might actually also be the most creative and innovative person on your team. And they're helping you to reach out for the good risks, and they're also protecting you from the bad risks. And so you really want that squeaky wheel on your team.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think back to the time when I was in the corporate world and I had a really squeaky wheel on my team. And sometimes people would make light of what she was saying. So there was some gender stuff there, perhaps. Often some of the things she said seemed weird to me, and some people would ridicule her. But I actually learnt very quickly that exactly what you were saying there, that there was always something to dig deeper on, even if my first reaction was that's a really weird thing to say, or that's a really weird viewpoint to take. I would always, after some time, after I learnt this, I would always dig deeper, and there was always something there. There was always something to learn from that. So I certainly agree with that. That was something I experienced firsthand.
Yeah, and your comment about the gender side of also, there is some research showing that among the different kinds of risks, I mean, men are more likely to take the speeding or drunk driving kinds of risks than women are. But on social risks, on that speaking up, women are actually more likely to do that. And I think it's partly because a lot of women have had a lot more experience with it. I mean, it's less and less of a problem as time goes by, but there have been so many times, particularly having a background in finance and policy, where women have tended to be underrepresented. I've often been the only woman in the room, or just a couple women in the room, and women risk either being completely ignored, or saying something and everybody ignores it, and then 2 minutes later, some guy raises his hand and says the exact same thing, and everyone says, "Oh, that was most brilliant."
That's a great idea. Yeah.
So women have a lot more experience with social risk, and experience is another very, very important determiner of risk perceptions and success in dealing with the risk. I mean, it's like building a muscle. The more you take certain kinds of risks, the more comfortable you are with them. And that is, of course, a double-edged sword, that you can become too comfortable with it. So that's why you need the people around you with different risk tolerances for different kinds of activity. Because even if you are the most experienced person in the world with X type of risk, it's the nature of it might change, and you can always use that another point of view.
Yeah. Fascinating insights. Well, I think we need to leave people some curiosity that they'll go and get a hold of your books and read your books. So it's a good point now, I think, to move on to the buzz, which is our innovation round. It's the same 5 questions I ask of every guest. And the idea is that you'll give us some really insightful answers and inspire some action for the listener to take to do something awesome today. So ready?
Sounds good. Ready to go.
Number one thing anyone needs to to do to be more innovative?
To be self-aware, particularly when it comes to risk, whether you think that a risk is positive or negative, and to pay attention to that bias and correct for it.
Yeah, and we've had lengthy conversations on that risk, and we've touched a couple of times on the connection between risk and innovation, and risk tolerance. So what's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas, Michele?
Believe it or not, walking in the park with my dog, particularly with water nearby. And to be honest, it wasn't an easy thing to learn to do. I'm like the nose to the grindstone workaholic. It was actually a challenge to learn to just chill out. And that's why I got a dog. That's why I would never be without a dog again. So dog, whether it's a puppy or older dog, seriously good for creativity, for innovation. I would be trying to write something and it wouldn't come to my head. And so I say, all right, well, my dog would say, all right, lady, get up. We're going to go out. And, out there at the fresh air, all of a sudden I would get this breakthrough idea that solved whatever the problem was. And then I'd say, I can't believe I didn't come up with that yet. So fresh air, walks in the park, particularly next to a large body of water. Yeah.
And what's the role of the water in that?
I don't know. It just, to be honest, I just read some newspaper article, some study. So, I read it in the newspaper, so it must be true, right? But that, that water is actually a really good stress relieving tool, whether you're immersing yourself in it or just being near it. It has some sort of magical property, according to this authoritative article that I read somewhere.
Okay. I was just wondering whether it has to be flowing water. And I find the sound of flowing water, a gentle stream or a fountain or something like that, I find that very soothing. So that I thought maybe it's something like that.
It makes sense. It's intuitive. So I'm willing to go with that research, just like the research that shows that the chocolate is good for you.
Okay. All right. Do you have a favorite resource you use most often?
I'm so bad with favorites, and that actually might be, part of the creativity and the systems thinking. And, I think the biggest one is really not one thing, but rather I've got a great network of friends, professional contacts all over the world. And if I take a step back and say, hey, who can help me with this? Who knows more about this? I've almost always got either someone to go to or someone who can tell me who to go to.
Yeah.
And that sort of social environment is another part of the sort of risk habits and processes and personal ecosystem that you can develop. It's just really, really, it's very, very supportive, and it helps you to get the information you need, which helps you to make better decisions, which is really what better risk taking is about.
Yeah, that's really the value of our network. And you've touched on a lot of things there. A lot of people talk about your net worth is your network in the sense of business and in the sense of if you're wanting to make a sale or launch a new product or somebody, you have a network that can support you in that. But what you've talked about there is people that can actually be sounding boards, people that can actually help you identify, hey, you're missing that Gray Rhino that's over there on the left, or people that can say, well, if you know these things, then you can mitigate those risks and perhaps make them less risky.
Absolutely. There's no reason to be too proud to have a sounding board. It's, to be humble enough to know that you need one is a superpower.
Which comes back to self-awareness, right? All right. Now, what's the best way to keep a project on track or a client on track if there's this ever-changing environment and there's these new risks coming up from time to time?
It's, as I said before, if you make an action, you need to kind of keep on track how it's working out. And so, tracking tools, I think, are very important without being too rigid. And really Gray Rhino theory is about this question that, what's the big thing coming at me and how am I doing in dealing with it? And, so for me, this sort of 5-stage. Are you denying something? Are you diagnosing it? Do you feel a sense of urgency? Are you muddling through? Are you acting about it? Just doing a temperature check as to where you are in that process and to where the other stakeholders are, the people who have the power to help you, or the people who have the power to get in the way, or the people who are also affected by the same problem, but maybe don't have enough power to do something about it. So just really saying, this is obvious. Am I doing the right thing, and how can I do it better?
And taking the time, as you say, because sometimes we think it's obvious, or we make the assumption that everybody understands where we're at, but take the time to say, no, I'll challenge that assumption. I'll check to make sure that all
don't
those...
Don't take the obvious for granted. You know, things that seem obvious to you aren't to other people. And even if something's, almost if something is super obvious to you, you're even more likely to make a misstep than if something's not obvious, because you'll get overconfident.
All right. And finally, for the buzz, the last question, what's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
It's to look at to actually take a look at what's in front of them. Ask yourself, what's my gray rhino? And then figure out, what you're doing about it and how you can do better. Because, as I said, a lot of people think they're dealing with things that they aren't. And so the ones who do, I like to call them game wardens. They find the rhino, the baby rhino, when it's super cute. And I highly recommend baby rhino videos, by the way. My friends send them to me all the time. The game warden, keeps the baby rhino, tiny and cute. And so that way, when the rhino gets big, it doesn't want to charge you.
Yeah. Excellent. I love that metaphor.
It's the most amazing metaphor. Yeah. And I love that a lot of people will apply it in their own, some of them see the rhino on the horizon behind the grasses. Some of them see it right in front of them. For some of them, it's moving fast. For some, it's moving slow. It's, there are all kinds of different rhinos, and it's such a fun metaphor. And they're amazing animals. I was just really amazed doing the research and learning about them. So it's, I highly encourage research into any kind of rhino at all. They're just amazing beasts.
Okay, great way to wrap up the buzz round. So thanks, Michele. This has been wonderful. Now, where can people find out more about the work you do, and, of course, get a hold of both books, The Gray Rhino and You Are What You Risk, and maybe even get in touch and send you some rhino videos if you haven't seen those already.
I love rhino videos. So my website is thegrayrhino.com. It's with the American A, but the E will get you there. In hindsight, I wish I had titled the book more international English, but hindsight is 2020. So thegrayrhino.com. I'm on Twitter at Wucker, Wucker. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I try to write about gray rhinos more frequently than I actually do, but the intention is there. Where good intentions lie. But I do post a lot about relevant articles, try to share some insights, and occasionally do post both about big global gray rhinos, but also about some of these behavioral and psychological tools that you can use to do a better job of recognizing your gray rhinos and of making better risk decisions, and also looking at how these sort of risk psychologies and cultures play into some of the big global events and companies and big trends in our society today.
Excellent. And of course, we'll have those links in the show notes so people can click straight through. So what action would you like our listener to take away from our conversation today?
Go back and think about the top big obvious problems in your life. Pick one of them. Imagine it as a rhino with the name of it tattooed across its horn, and ask yourself what you're doing about it, how you can do a better job, and then start really holding yourself accountable to taming that gray rhino.
Excellent. And that's a great action. And of course, it's a great exercise, I think, to kind of learn more about your own response to risk, your own attitude to risk. And you talked, of course, about being more self-aware of those things as we look at those problems, those grey rhinos that are there either behind the grass or right in front of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Finally, Michele, who else should I get on this show and why?
Oh my goodness. Well, one is my good friend April Rinney, who's got a book called Flux that came
Hmm.
out quite recently. So definitely happy to put you in touch with her. We've actually done a bunch of podcasts together because this idea of flux and uncertainty is so closely related to a lot of the work that I do with risk and uncertainty and dealing with a world where you don't have as much control as you would like to.
Excellent. Well, we'll get an introduction to Abel from you, and yeah, I'll have to. That's another book to add to my list to read. Thanks for that, and thanks so
My
much for
pleasure.
sharing your time and your insights and those rhino stories with us today, Michele. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I've really enjoyed the conversation and learnt quite a bit as well about particularly that kind of risk fingerprint, as you called it, and really being aware of our own attitudes to risk in different environments, and then how the organisations that we're part of, how they come together and treat risk as well. So thanks for that, and
Thanks
let's
for
stay.
inviting me. It's been a real pleasure talking with you as well.
Thanks.